Silas looked at the rusted hut and laughed. 12 feet of corrugated metal, rotted timber, leaning so hard to the west it looked like it was tired of standing. The kind of structure a local scrapyard wouldn't even bother hauling away for free. He had seen condemned buildings with more dignity than this. He had demolished properties that cost the owner more in court fees than this thing was worth in parts. "It's a miracle it hasn't collapsed on its own," he said, loud enough for his crew to hear. Nobody laughed back. There was no crew yet, just Silas, the mountain, and the silence. Then a voice answered, "The miracles in this world rarely look like miracles on the outside." He turned. An elderly woman was standing in the shadow of an ancient oak tree, her hand resting flat against the rusted siding as if she were touching the skin of something alive. She wasn't looking at him with anger. She wasn't looking at him with fear. She was looking at him the way a doctor looks at a patient who just told a joke about how healthy he feels. Silas opened his mouth to say something. She spoke first. "You're laughing at the rust," she said quietly. "But when you see what's underneath it, you'll understand that you just laughed at the only thing still holding this valley together." He didn't answer. He looked at the hut, then back at her, then at the hut again. Silas Vance had been in construction since he was 19 years old. He had managed projects in 6 states. He had torn down buildings that historians wept over and built luxury developments on land that locals swore was sacred. He was 28, he was good at his job, and he had never, not once, been made to feel small by a ruin. He turned back toward his truck, pulling the laser measure from his belt. He would document the structure, file the demolition clearance, and have this thing in the ground before lunch. He aimed the device at the corner of the hut. 99 feet. The structure was 12 feet wide. He tried the opposite wall. 99 feet. Error code. 99 feet. He shook the device. Tried again. Error. The red dot danced across the rusted surface and refused to lock. He lowered the measure and looked at it the way you look at something expensive that has just stopped working for no reason. $400. Never failed him before. Not once. He pulled out his phone to document the anomaly. The screen was black. He pressed the power button. Nothing. He had charged it fully that morning. He always did. Same routine, same charger, same outlet in the site trailer. He pressed the button again. Nothing. He looked up at the hut. 12 feet of rust and rot. A line item on a demolition schedule. A problem that would be solved by noon. Something beneath his boots vibrated. Low, rhythmic, mechanical. Not the wind. Not the distant construction crew in the valley below. Something under the ground, directly beneath the structure, running steadily, like a machine that had never been switched off. He took one step closer to the hut and stopped. The hair on his forearms was standing up, not from cold. The morning air was warm. He looked down at his arms, then back at the building, and for the first time that morning, for the first time in a long time, Silas Vance felt something he didn't have a category for. The woman's voice came from directly behind him. "Your equipment isn't broken," she said. "The building is interfering with it. Has been since 1973. He turned slowly. She was closer now, standing at the edge of a perfect ring of gray gravel that circled the base of the structure. Gravel that looked as if it had been placed there yesterday, not a stone out of position, not a weed pushing through. She wasn't looking at him anymore. She was looking at the hut. Her expression was something between grief and pride. "That structure," she said, "is the only reason this valley still has clean water. Tear it down, and by spring you won't." Silas stared at her. "What did you just say?" She didn't repeat it. She didn't need to. She turned and walked back toward the shadow of the oak, and by the time he took 2 steps after her, she was gone, swallowed by the tree line, as if she had never been there at all. He stood alone on the ridge, the rusted hut behind him, his dead phone in one hand and his useless measure in the other. Down in the valley he could hear the distant whine of power saws and the rhythmic thud of nail guns, the sound of progress, the sound of his career moving forward. But something had changed. He didn't know what it was yet. He only knew that the laughter was gone. From which city in the world are you watching today? Drop your location in the comments. And if you want to know what a laser measure can't read and why the government sent 2 vehicles up that ridge within the hour, hit subscribe. Because when Silas finally stepped inside that hut, he found something his engineering degree had no category for. And the name on the original blueprint was his own. Silas walked back to his truck, the soles of his expensive high-traction boots crunching on the dry, stubborn earth of the ridge. To him, this land wasn't a home or a piece of history. It was a logistical puzzle waiting for a solution. He didn't see a legacy in the sweeping views of the valley below. He saw a prime real estate opportunity, a chessboard where he was the grandmaster moving the pieces toward a profitable conclusion. Silas prided himself on being a man of the future, a builder who relied on data, blueprints, and the cold efficiency of modern technology. Every morning, his routine followed a strict, unwavering pattern. He would arrive at the construction site at precisely 6:30, just as the sun began its struggle to pierce through the thick mountain mist that clung to the trees like a damp shroud. He would sit in the climate-controlled cab of his heavy-duty pickup, the engine humming with a quiet, expensive power. There, he would open his high-definition tablet, his fingers dancing across the screen to check the topographical maps, the soil density reports, and the satellite imagery that defined his world. He didn't believe in feeling a piece of land. He believed in measuring it down to the millimeter. At 28, Silas was already the lead project manager for a firm that was transforming this quiet, forgotten mountain into an exclusive gated community. He saw progress as an inevitable force, a tide that washed away anything that couldn't justify its existence on a spreadsheet. To him, anything old was simply obsolete, a barrier to the sleek glass and steel vision he carried in his mind. He stepped out of the truck, the sharp air smelling of pine needles and the faint metallic scent of damp earth. He turned his gaze toward the hut again. It sat on the highest point of the ridge, a jagged orange silhouette against the pale morning sky. It was an unusual construction, even by the standards of the local mountaineers. Most old cabins in this part of the country were built of stacked cedar logs or rough-hewn local stone, but this structure was clad in thick, corrugated metal plates. They had turned a deep burnt orange from decades of exposure to the elements, the rust forming a protective skin that looked more like dragon scales than building material. The roof was pitched at an unnaturally steep angle, a design meant for heavy snows that the valley hadn't seen in over half a century. Silas pulled a laser measuring device from his belt, a tool that cost more than most people's monthly rent. He aimed it at the hut's corner, intending to mark the boundaries for the upcoming demolition. The small red dot danced across the rusted surface, but the device failed to beep. Instead of a precise digital reading, the screen flickered wildly, the numbers jumping from 3 feet to 99 feet before flashing a bright red error code. Silas frowned, shaking the small tool as if it were a stubborn flashlight. He tried again, targeting a different section of the metal plating, but the laser refused to lock. "Cheap sensors," he muttered to himself, his voice sounding thin in the vast silence of the mountain. It never occurred to him that the problem might be the structure itself. He began a slow, methodical walk around the perimeter of the hut, keeping a distance that he deemed safe from the decaying timber. But as he circled, he noticed details that challenged his dismissal of the place. The foundation wasn't visible, yet the earth at the base of the walls was unnaturally level. There were no weeds, no creeping vines, and no wildflowers growing within a 3-foot radius of the structure. Instead, there was a perfectly circular ring of fine, gray gravel that looked as if it had been meticulously placed there only yesterday. The door was another curiosity. It was made of white oak, heavy and dark, and it lacked a traditional handle or a keyhole. In the center of the wood, there was a small, circular indentation, polished so smooth that it caught the morning light like a mirror. Silas reached out, his hand hovering over the wood, but he pulled back at the last moment. A strange sensation, like static electricity, prickled at the hair on his arms. He looked down toward the valley floor, where the skeleton of the first luxury mansion was already being framed. The distant whine of power saws and the rhythmic thud of nail guns drifted up on the wind. It was the sound of change, the sound of his career moving forward. He felt a surge of renewed confidence. He had handled stubborn landowners and difficult terrain before. This was just another hurdle. He just needed to show the old woman, Clara, that her memories couldn't compete with the future. But as he turned back toward his truck, he felt a faint vibration in the soles of his boots. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't the distant construction. It was a low, mechanical pulse coming from the very ground beneath the hut. Silas reached for his tablet to record the anomaly, but as he touched the screen, the device went completely black. The battery, which had been full just moments ago, was dead. He stood there in the sudden silence, the rusted hut watching him with the cold, patient eyes of a secret that was tired of being kept. Silas stood by the open door of his truck, his thumb repeatedly pressing the power button on his dead tablet. The silence of the mountain, usually so peaceful to those who lived here, now felt like a heavy weight pressing against his eardrums. He looked back at the hut, the rusted metal shimmering in the rising sun. It looked like a discarded toy left to rot in the grass, yet his high-end equipment had treated it like a black hole. He climbed into the driver's seat and slammed the door, the sound echoing off the rock faces behind him. He reached for his phone, intended to call the office to report a hardware failure, but his screen displayed a notification that stopped his breath. It wasn't a text or a missed call. It was a high-priority alert from the company's main server, a red banner across the top of his display that read, "Operation Cease Work, Sector 4G, Coordinates Restricted, Await On-Site Liaison." Sector 4G was exactly where he was standing. Silas felt a flash of irritation. He was the lead on this project. He was the one who gave the orders, not the one who received mysterious banners on his phone. Before he could even navigate to his email, a cloud of dust appeared on the winding access road below. A dark, unremarkable sedan was moving up the mountain at a speed that ignored the treacherous curves of the gravel path. It didn't look like a construction vehicle. It looked like authority. The car pulled up alongside Silas's truck, kicking up a gritty veil of red mountain clay. A man stepped out, dressed in a charcoal suit that looked entirely too expensive for a dirt ridge in the middle of nowhere. He didn't look at Silas. He looked past him, his eyes locking onto the rusted hut with an expression that wasn't dismissive or curious. It was grim. "You're Silas Vance?" the man asked, his voice clipped and formal. He didn't offer a hand or a name. He simply adjusted his sunglasses, his gaze never wavering from the structure. "I am," Silas replied, stepping out of his truck and trying to reclaim his sense of command. "And you are? My firm hasn't mentioned any liaisons for this phase." "My name is Agent Miller," the man said, pulling a small leather wallet from his pocket and flicking it open to reveal a badge that Silas didn't recognize, though it bore a seal that looked uncomfortably official. "And your firm was informed 10 minutes ago. This sector is no longer under your jurisdiction for demolition. You are to remain on site as a technical observer, but you are not to touch that structure. Do you understand?" Silas scoffed, the sound sharp and defensive. "That's a rusted garden shed, Miller. It's sitting on a $300 million development site. My crew is scheduled to level it by noon. If there's a historical preservation issue, we already cleared the environmental impact study 6 months ago." Miller finally turned his head, his eyes cold behind the dark lenses. "This isn't about history, Mr. Vance, and it certainly isn't about the environment. It's about national security. You were told the build would shock you. You should have listened to the woman." Silas froze. He hadn't told Miller about Clara. He hadn't told anyone about the encounter by the oak tree. The irritation he had felt moments ago was suddenly replaced by a cold, creeping sensation in the pit of his stomach. Others knew about this place. Powerful people knew that this junk was more than it seemed. Miller stepped toward the hut, stopping exactly at the edge of the gray gravel ring Silas had noticed earlier. He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a device that looked like a heavy-duty Geiger counter, but as he swept it through the air, it didn't click. It hummed, a low, rhythmic sound that matched the vibration Silas had felt beneath his boots. "Why is the government interested in a pile of scrap metal?" Silas asked, his voice lower now, the arrogance beginning to fracture. Miller didn't answer. He just watched the readings on his device, his face a mask of professional concern. "You see rust, Vance," Miller said quietly, almost to himself, "but we see a lock that hasn't been opened in 50 years, and God help us if the key is still inside." Miller didn't wait for Silas to recover his composure. He stepped onto that ring of gray gravel, and the moment his weight shifted onto the stones, the low hum from beneath the earth changed pitch. It became a sharp, rhythmic throb, vibrating through the air like a heavy heartbeat. Miller held his device out toward the rusted metal siding, and the screen didn't just show numbers anymore. It projected a grid of soft blue light onto the burnt orange surface. Silas watched, mesmerized and horrified, as the blue lines traced the edges of the corrugated plates. They weren't held together by rivets or welds. The light revealed a pattern of interlocking seams so precise, so incredibly tight, that no modern CNC machine could have cut them. "Look at the oxidation patterns," Miller commanded, though he wasn't looking at Silas. "You see rust, you see age, but look at the way the light reflects off the pits in the metal." Silas stepped closer, his professional curiosity briefly overriding his fear. He saw it then. The rust wasn't flaking off. It wasn't brittle. Under the intense glare of the morning sun and the agent's scanner, the orange coating looked more like a liquid that had been frozen in time. When Miller tapped a small hammer against the wall, the sound wasn't the dull thud of decaying iron. It was a clear, high-pitched ring that sustained itself for nearly 10 seconds, vibrating in Silas's very teeth. It was an alloy he had never studied in engineering school, a material that seemed to absorb the heat of the sun rather than reflecting it. The hut wasn't a building. It was a casing, a shell designed to withstand pressures and temperatures that would melt a standard skyscraper into a puddle of slag. Miller moved to the oak door, his fingers tracing that strange, smooth indentation in the center of the wood. "This wood is white oak, at least on the surface," Miller whispered. "But the density readings are off the charts. It's reinforced with a carbon lattice core. This door alone weighs more than your entire truck, Mr. Vance. It's not meant to keep people out. It's meant to keep something in." As Miller spoke, he pulled a small, translucent card from his pocket, a key that looked like a sliver of frosted glass. He pressed it into the circular indentation. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, a series of mechanical clicks echoed from deep within the structure, a sound like a giant clock resetting its gears. The rusted metal plates didn't just sit there, they shifted. They groaned and slid against one another, realigning in a complex geometric dance that made Silas dizzy just to watch. This wasn't a ruin. It was a dormant machine, and Miller was waking it up. The atmosphere on the ridge shifted instantly from eerie silence to a digital storm. Silas's truck, parked 20 feet away, suddenly roared to life. The headlights flickered in a frantic Morse code, and the horn began a long, mournful blast that wouldn't stop. Silas ran to the cab, grabbing the handle, but the electronic locks were cycling so fast they sounded like a machine gun. He looked through the window at his dashboard. Every warning light was illuminated. The GPS screen was a riot of static, but through the noise a single word began to repeat in bright, jagged letters: "Evacuate, evacuate, evacuate." His phone, sitting in the center console, began to vibrate with such violence that it skittered across the leather. He could see the screen from the window. He was receiving hundreds of text messages a second, all from unknown sender, and all of them were empty except for a timestamp that was 40 years in the past. Miller didn't seem surprised, but his movements became faster, more urgent. He grabbed Silas by the shoulder and shoved him back toward the car. "Get away from the perimeter!" he shouted over the roar of the truck's horn. "The local grid is collapsing!" Silas looked down toward the valley. The lights in the construction trailers below were flickering and popping, sending small bursts of blue sparks into the air. The giant crane he had brought in just last week was beginning to rotate on its own, its heavy arms swinging aimlessly like a blind giant. High above the mountain, the clear blue sky was being carved up by the white trails of high-altitude drones. Silas could count 6, then 8, then a dozen, circling the ridge in a tight, predatory formation. They weren't news drones or commercial craft. These were sleek, black shapes that hovered with an unnatural stillness. Their sensors pointed directly at the hut. "What is happening?" Silas screamed, his voice barely audible over the mechanical chaos. "What did you do?" "I didn't do anything," Miller yelled back, his eyes fixed on the hut's shifting metal plates. The internal sensors detected a breach in the local digital fence. "It's not just the government watching this place, Vance. Someone else just tripped the silent alarm, and they're coming to claim what's inside." Miller pointed toward the access road. Through the trees, Silas could see the glint of more black SUVs, a whole convoy of them, weaving up the mountain with terrifying speed. They weren't using sirens, but they were moving with a singular, violent purpose. At the same time, the tablet in Silas's hand, the one that had been dead moments ago, suddenly flashed to life. It didn't show his blueprints. It showed a live feed from a camera he didn't recognize. The image was grainy, black and white, and it showed the very spot where he was standing, seen from high above. A red reticle was centered exactly on his chest. The ticking clock wasn't just a metaphor anymore. A deep, resonant chime began to sound from within the hut, a tone so low it felt like it was shaking the marrow in Silas's bones. With every chime, the orange rust on the building seemed to pulse, glowing with a faint, sickly violet light. The gray gravel ring began to sink into the earth, forming a perfect trench around the structure. Silas felt the ground beneath his feet begin to tilt. The entire ridge was being reconfigured. The luxury homes, the blueprints, the millions of dollars in investment. It all felt like dust in the wind compared to the raw, ancient power being unleashed right in front of him. He looked for Clara, the old woman, but she was gone, vanished into the shadows of the oaks, as if she had never been there at all. Only her words remained, echoing in the back of his mind. "The build will shock you." Miller grabbed a heavy radio from his belt. "This is Miller. Initiate level 6 blackout. We have a signature match. I repeat, the Phoenix is breathing. Shut down the valley, lock the gates." He turned to Silas, his face pale and sweat-beaded. "If you want to live to see tomorrow, you stop being a builder and start being a shadow. Follow me and don't look back." As they dove for cover behind the heavy sedan, a massive shadow swept over the ridge. A military transport helicopter, larger than any Silas had ever seen, crested the mountain, its rotors kicking up a hurricane of dust and dead leaves. The standoff had begun, and Silas was caught in the center of a war for a secret he was never supposed to know. The hurricane of dust kicked up by the transport helicopter felt like a physical wall, stinging Silas's skin and forcing him to shield his eyes. Through the swirling red haze and the deafening roar of the rotors, he saw the convoy of black SUVs skid to a halt just outside the gray gravel ring. The doors flew open with synchronized precision, and men in tactical gear, devoid of any insignias or flags, stepped out. They didn't move like soldiers, they moved like hunters. Their weapons were short-barreled, high-tech, and pointed with lethal intent at both Agent Miller and the shifting, glowing structure that had once been a humble hut. Silas pressed his back against the cold metal of Miller's sedan, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The luxury mansions he had planned for this ridge, the millions of dollars in commissions, the pride he took in his modern mastery of the earth, it all vanished in an instant. He felt small. He felt like a child playing with blocks while the real architects of the world finally sat down at the table. Miller was on his radio, shouting commands that were swallowed by the wind, but his eyes never left the lead SUV. A man stepped out from the passenger side, dressed not in tactical gear, but in a simple, sharp suit that defied the dust. He walked forward with an eerie calmness, stopping just 10 feet from the trench where the gravel had vanished. He looked at the hut, now pulsing with a deep, rhythmic violet light, and smiled. It wasn't a smile of admiration. It was the smile of a man looking at a prize he had been chasing for a lifetime. "Step back, Miller," the man called out, his voice amplified by some unseen tech. "The department had 50 years to figure out the frequency. You failed. We have the resonance key now. The build belongs to those who can actually utilize it." Silas watched as the man held up a device that looked like a jagged piece of obsidian. It hummed with a discordant, screeching sound that set Silas's teeth on edge. The violet light of the hut flickered. The metal plates, which had been sliding with such mathematical grace, began to shudder and grind. The sound was agonizing, the sound of a beautiful machine being forced to break its own heart. Silas felt a surge of something he didn't expect, protective anger. As a builder, he knew the sound of a structural failure. He knew the sound of a design being violated. This wasn't just a thing to be fought over, it was a masterpiece, and these men were trying to pry it open with a crowbar of static. "You're killing it," Silas screamed, his voice cracking. He didn't know why he said it, or how he knew it was true, but the sight of those precision-cut seams being forced apart felt like an assault on everything he had ever studied about integrity and form. The man in the suit glanced at Silas with total indifference. "It's a vault, boy, and vaults are meant to be cracked." Just as the obsidian device began to glow with a sickly green light, a shadow moved from behind the ancient oak tree. Clara stepped into the clearing. She didn't run, and she didn't hide. She walked directly toward the trench, her canvas jacket fluttering in the gale from the helicopter. To Silas's horror, she didn't stop at the edge. She walked right onto the vibrating earth, and as her boots touched the soil, the violet light of the hut stabilized. The grinding sound stopped instantly, replaced by a deep, resonant chord that sounded like 1,000 cellos playing in unison. The green light from the antagonist's device sputtered and died. "The build isn't a vault, Marcus," Clara said, her voice cutting through the mechanical roar with an authority that stopped every man in his tracks. She wasn't looking at the guns or the helicopters. She was looking at the suit-clad man with a weary, maternal sadness. "And it isn't a weapon. If you had spent half as much time learning the blueprints as you did trying to steal them, you'd know that." The man called Marcus narrowed his eyes. "Clara, I thought you'd be in the ground by now. Give us the sequence. You know we'll take this ridge eventually. You're just delaying the inevitable." "I'm not delaying anything," she replied, turning her back on him to look at the hut. "I'm fulfilling the final phase." She looked over at Silas, her eyes bright and piercing. "Silas, look at the corners. Look at the way the light flows." Silas, driven by a sudden, desperate need to understand, peered over the edge of the sedan. He saw it now. The violet light wasn't just a glow, it was information. Tiny, microscopic lines of light were flowing through the rust, forming a map, not of the mountain, but of a global network. He saw the seeds Clara had mentioned. The gray gravel hadn't just sunk, it had been absorbed into the foundation as a conductive medium. The rusted metal plates began to fold back, not like a door opening, but like a flower blooming. Underneath the orange oxidation was a material so beautiful it made Silas's breath catch in his throat. It was a translucent composite, shimmering with the iridescence of a pearl, but with the strength of diamond, and inside, visible through the crystalline walls, weren't gold bars or hard drives or weapons. It was a garden, a lush, vibrant sanctuary of plants that shouldn't exist, species that had been extinct for centuries, glowing with a bioluminescence that provided its own atmosphere. In the center sat a pedestal holding a simple, leather-bound ledger and a handful of glass vials filled with clear liquid. "This is the build," Clara whispered, and though she was 20 feet away, Silas heard her perfectly. "This is the noble human purpose. When the world decided to prioritize profit over the planet, a group of architects and scientists built this, not to hide from the end, but to survive it. This hut is a pressurized, self-sustaining lifeboat for the natural world. It's the legacy of the old guard, the people who knew that true wealth isn't in gated communities, but in the breath of the forest." Marcus snarled, gesturing to his men. "I don't care about the weeds. Get the vials. That's the terraforming serum." As the tactical team moved forward, the hut emitted a blinding pulse of pure white light. It wasn't an explosion, it was a denial. The men were thrown backward not by force, but by a sudden localized shift in gravity that made it impossible to stand. The helicopter above began to drift, its sensors blinded by the sudden surge of organic energy. Silas, however, felt nothing but a warm breeze. He realized then that he was within the safe zone defined by the gravel ring. Clara walked to the crystalline wall and placed her hand against it. "It's time, Silas," she called out. "The world is about to find out that this ridge was never for sale. It was a guardian's post, and I'm too old to stand watch alone anymore." Silas looked at his tablet, which was now scrolling through a series of ancient, beautiful blueprints, the original designs for the hut. He saw the name of the lead architect at the bottom of the digital page, Vance, his grandfather's name. The worthless apron he wore, the stories he had dismissed as senile ramblings. It all clicked together like the seams of the hut. He wasn't just a developer who had stumbled onto a secret. He was the inheritance. The arrogance that had defined Silas for 28 years shattered completely. He looked at the men in suits, with their guns and their greed, and then he looked at the glowing garden protected by the rusted shell. He realized that his blueprints were nothing but a cage, while this build was a key. He stood up, stepping out from behind the sedan, and walked toward the trench. He didn't feel like a master of the earth anymore. He felt like a servant of it. "What do I do?" Silas asked, his voice steady for the first time that day. Clara smiled, and for the first time, she looked at him not as a nuisance, but as a peer. "You do what a Vance is born to do, Silas. You protect the foundation, because the world is going to try to tear this down, and they're going to need someone who knows exactly how it was built to stop them. As Marcus and his men scrambled to recover, a second pulse of light erupted from the ridge, sending a signal into the sky that could be seen for 100 miles. The secret was out. The noble purpose was revealed. And as Silas stood beside Clara at the threshold of the impossible garden, he knew that his life as a builder of houses was over. His life as a guardian of the legacy had just begun. The antagonistic forces were retreating for now, but they would be back with lawyers, with armies, with the full weight of a world that didn't understand the value of a seed. But Silas didn't care. He looked at the shimmering crystalline walls of the hut and realized that for the first time in his life, he was finally standing on solid ground. What do you think was inside those vials that Marcus was so desperate to steal? Drop your theories in the comments. If you're ready to see how Silas and Clara defend the ridge against the coming storm, hit the like button and subscribe. The true investigation is just beginning. Inside the hut, the air didn't smell like decay or damp earth. It smelled like a forest after a summer rain, crisp, ozone-heavy, and thick with the scent of blooming jasmine and ancient cedar. Silas stepped over the threshold, his boots making a soft, melodic chime against the iridescent floor. The walls, which looked like rusted iron from the outside, were transparent from within, allowing him to see the chaotic world outside, while feeling as if he were standing in a sanctuary at the bottom of a deep, calm lake. He looked at Clara, who seemed to have shed 20 years of age just by standing in this light. She reached out and touched the central pedestal, her fingers tracing the worn leather of the ledger. "Your grandfather didn't just build this, Silas," she said, her voice echoing with a strange harmonic quality. "He died protecting the secret of its location. They called it Project Ethelgard. In the 70s, while the world was obsessed with the Cold War and nuclear stockpiles, a few men and women realized that the real threat wasn't a bomb. It was the slow, quiet death of the natural world. They saw the chemicals in the water, the heat rising in the valleys, and the silence where the birds used to sing. They decided to build a vault that wouldn't just save people, but would save the soul of the planet itself." Silas reached for the ledger. His hand trembled as he opened the cover. On the first page, in a script he recognized from the few birthday cards he'd received as a child, were the words, "For the one who follows the line." Beneath the inscription was a hand-drawn map of the very ridge they were standing on, but the landmarks weren't luxury homes. They were pulse points, locations where the Earth's natural energy could be harnessed to power the vault for 1,000 years without a single wire or battery. He turned the pages, his eyes scanning the technical drawings. The rust wasn't rust at all. It was a bioreactive layer of iron-oxidizing bacteria engineered to create a self-healing, impenetrable Faraday cage. It fed on the sun and the rain, growing stronger as it aged. The broken appearance was the ultimate camouflage, a masterpiece of engineering designed to be ignored by a world that only valued the shiny and the new. Silas felt a hot sting of shame behind his eyes. He had spent his entire career tearing things down to make them better, never realizing that the greatest build in history was right here, disguised as junk. Clara pointed to the glass vials. The liquid inside didn't just sit still. It swirled with a slow, hypnotic gold luminescence. "These are the prime strains," she whispered, "seeds and spores of every plant species that has been lost to the march of progress. They are dormant, waiting for the right frequency to wake them up. Marcus and his employers don't want to save the world, Silas. They want to own the rebirth. They want to sell the air we breathe and the food we grow back to us at a premium. They see a commodity. Your grandfather saw a gift." Suddenly, a screen flickered to life on the far wall of the hut. It wasn't a modern LED panel. It was a shimmering curtain of light that projected a grainy black and white video. An old man sat in a chair, his face lined with the same stubborn determination Silas saw in the mirror every morning. It was Elias Vance. He looked into the camera, a faint smile touching his lips. "If you are seeing this," the recorded voice of Silas's grandfather began, "then the failsafe has been triggered. Either the world has become so loud that the mountain couldn't hide us anymore, or Vance has finally walked back up the trail." "Silas, if it's you, I'm sorry for the secrets. I'm sorry for the apron and the stories that sounded like fairy tales. But the truth is a heavy burden, and I wanted you to have a normal life for as long as possible. But the normal world is a dream. The ridge is the reality. You are now the architect of the restoration. The key isn't a code or a card, it's the resonance of your blood. The build will recognize you, it will protect you, but you must be the one to choose to open the gate for the rest of the world. The video faded, leaving Silas in a profound, heavy silence. Outside, he could see Agent Miller and the tactical teams regrouping. Marcus was on a satellite phone, his face twisted in a mask of fury. The digital siege Miller had warned about was intensifying. The transparent walls of the hut began to scroll with data, thousands of hacking attempts from around the globe hitting the vault's firewall every second. The world's elite had realized the Phoenix was breathing, and they were throwing everything they had at the mountain to silence it. "They're trying to overload the grid," Miller shouted, pressing his face against the crystalline barrier. "Vance, if you don't shut down the broadcast signal, they're going to trace this to every backup vault on the continent. You have to lock it down." Silas looked at the ledger, then at the vials, then at the glowing garden. If he locked it down, the secret would stay safe, but the world would continue its slow decay. If he opened it, he would be inviting a war to his doorstep. He looked at Clara, who was watching him with a patient, knowing expression. She wasn't going to tell him what to do. The build had waited 50 years for this moment. It had waited for him. He realized then that his arrogance hadn't been his greatest flaw. It had been his lack of imagination. He had believed that building meant imposing his will on the world. Now he understood that true building meant listening to what the world needed to survive. He reached out and touched the smooth indentation on the pedestal. The resonance his grandfather spoke of hummed through his fingertips, a warm, pulsing vibration that felt like a long-lost memory. "I'm not shutting it down," Silas said, his voice echoing through the chamber. "I'm not a demolition man anymore. I'm an architect, and it's time we started the real build." He turned the ledger to the final page, where a complex geometric pattern was etched into the leather. It was the frequency map for the prime strains. As his fingers traced the lines, the violet light in the hut shifted to a brilliant emerald green. The ground beneath the ridge began to groan, not with the sound of breaking, but with the sound of growth. Across the valley, the gray gravel rings at the other pulse points began to glow. The investigation was over. The truth was unlocked. But the battle for the future had only just begun. As the first emerald light shot into the atmosphere, signaling the start of the restoration, Silas saw a fleet of black helicopters cresting the horizon. Marcus hadn't given up. He was bringing the full weight of his empire to the ridge. Silas stood tall, the iridescent walls of his grandfather's legacy shimmering around him. He wasn't afraid. For the first time in his life, he knew exactly what he was building for. "Clara," Silas said, watching the approaching storm, "how do we fight a world that doesn't want to be saved?" "We don't fight them with iron, Silas," she replied, stepping up beside him. "We fight them with life. And life always finds a way." The emerald light pulsing from the ridge didn't just illuminate the mountain, it acted as a beacon for those who had been waiting in the shadows for half a century. As the helicopters drew closer, their spotlights sweeping the forest floor, a series of smaller, faster lights appeared from the tree line below. They weren't drones or government craft. They were vintage motorcycles and rugged, dented trucks, driven by men and women whose hair was white, but whose eyes were sharp with a sudden, revitalized purpose. "The old guard," Clara whispered, a tear finally tracing a path through the dust on her cheek. They heard the chime. They knew Elias wouldn't wake the mountain unless it was time. One of the trucks skidded to a halt near the trench, and an old man climbed out, leaning on a cane made from the same white oak as the hut's door. He walked past Marcus's stunned tactical team as if they were made of glass. He stopped at the edge of the trench and looked up at the transparent walls, his gaze finding Silas. He didn't speak through a radio. He simply pressed a weathered palm against the crystalline surface. Silas felt a notification on his tablet, not a hack, but a direct file transfer. He opened it. It was an eyewitness account, a digital diary from 1974. The video was clear, stabilized by tech that shouldn't have existed in that era. It showed the man outside, younger then, standing in a jungle clearing. He was standing next to Silas's grandfather. They were unloading crates marked with the same violet seal that now pulsed on the hut. "We were the ghost builders," the man's recorded voice narrated over the footage. We went into the dead zones, the places where the soil had been poisoned by war and greed. We planted the first seeds of the phoenix. We saw forests regrow in a week. We saw rivers turn clear in a day. We knew then that we were holding the most dangerous weapon in the world, the power to make the powerful irrelevant. If people could grow their own paradise, they wouldn't need to serve a master. That's why they hunted us. That's why we had to hide the build on this ridge. The video showed Silas's grandfather looking into the camera, holding a handful of the same gold-flecked vials Silas now held. "This isn't for us," Elias said in the video. "It's for the one who comes after. It's for the builder who realizes that a house is just a box, but a home is an ecosystem." The confirmation was absolute. Silas wasn't just looking at a secret project, he was looking at a global insurance policy for humanity. The data on the screen began to map out the other vaults, hundreds of them hidden under rusted huts in every corner of the planet. They were all waiting for the signal Silas had just sent. The restoration wasn't just happening on this mountain, it was waking up in the deserts of Africa, the frozen tundras of Siberia, and the concrete jungles of New York. Marcus screamed an order and his men began to fire. The bullets hit the iridescent walls of the hut and didn't shatter the glass. They were absorbed. The material rippled like water, turning the kinetic energy of the rounds into light. The violet glow intensified with every shot, creating a blinding aura around the structure that made it impossible for the shooters to aim. "You can't stop it," Silas yelled, his voice bolstered by the harmonic resonance of the chamber. "The build is self-correcting. Every attack only gives it more power." But Marcus wasn't listening. He ran to his lead SUV and pulled out a heavy, specialized crate. He began to assemble a thermal lance, a weapon designed to cut through the hulls of nuclear submarines. He was willing to destroy the garden, the seeds, and everyone on the ridge just to prove that he could break the vault. "Silas," Clara said, her voice urgent now. "The final message from your grandfather. The one at the end of the ledger. You need to read it now. There's a defensive sequence we haven't activated." Silas flipped to the very last page. The paper was different here, thin, translucent, and cool to the touch. The words were written in a shimmering ink that only appeared when the green light of the garden hit it. "To my architect," the note read, "the greatest strength of the build isn't the walls, it's the connection. To protect the sanctuary, you must stop being an observer. You must become part of the system. Place the prime strain in the central vent. Let the mountain breathe." Silas looked at the vials. He looked at Marcus, who was now igniting the thermal lance, the white-hot flame roaring toward the crystalline barrier. There was no time for blueprints. There was no time for levels or measurements. He uncapped the lead vial. The golden liquid didn't spill. It rose into the air, drawn toward a small hexagonal opening in the center of the pedestal. As the liquid entered the vent, Silas felt a sudden, profound connection to the earth beneath him. He could feel the roots of the ancient oaks. He could feel the flow of the underground springs. He could feel the heartbeat of the mountain itself. He wasn't Silas Vance, the builder of luxury homes, anymore. He was the mountain. He raised his hand, and as he did, the ground beneath Marcus's SUV erupted, not with an explosion of fire, but with a sudden violent growth of thick iron-hard vines. The plants moved with predatory speed, wrapping around the vehicles, the weapons, and the men themselves. They didn't crush. They simply restrained, pinning the invaders to the earth with a strength that made the thermal lance look like a candle in a hurricane. The helicopters above were caught in a sudden updraft of pollen and oxygen-rich air that stalled their engines, forcing them to descend into the safety of the valley floor. Within minutes, the ridge was quiet again. The tactical teams were trapped in a green web of their own making, their high-tech gear rendered useless by the raw power of the natural world. Silas stood in the center of the hut, his chest heaving. The green light was fading into a soft, steady glow. The rust on the outside had begun to flake away for real now, revealing the shimmering, pearl-like structure to the world. The climax was over. The ridge was secure. But as Silas looked at the ledger, he saw the thousands of other icons on the map still blinking red. The world was waking up, and they would need an architect to show them how to live in the new world. "What now?" Silas asked, looking at the silent, restrained men outside. "Now," Clara said, stepping toward the open door, "we invite them in. Not as owners, but as students. The build is finished, Silas. Now the living begins." The sun that rose over the ridge the following morning didn't just illuminate the valley, it seemed to sanctify it. The mist was gone, replaced by an air so clear it felt as though the world had been scrubbed clean overnight. Silas stood on the porch of the crystalline structure, no longer seeing a rusted hut, but a lighthouse. His high-tech boots, once the pride of his professional wardrobe, were caked in the red clay of the mountain, and for the first time in his life, he didn't care about the scuffs. He looked down at his hands, still feeling the faint ghost hum of the mountain's heartbeat. The arrogance that had been his armor for nearly a decade had been stripped away, leaving behind something raw and purposeful. He looked at the construction site below where the half-finished skeletons of luxury mansions stood like hollow monuments to a dead philosophy. They weren't buildings, they were scars, and he knew, with a certainty that reached into his marrow, that he would never finish them. The silence of the mountain was soon broken, not by the violent roar of tactical engines, but by the rhythmic pulse of global attention. The emerald light he had triggered hadn't just been a local display, it had been a digital and physical broadcast that bypassed every firewall on the planet. By noon, the first authorized convoy arrived. These weren't the shadows like Marcus or the frantic agents like Miller. These were the men and women in white lab coats and academic blazers, the representatives of the great institutions, the Smithsonian, the National Academy of Sciences, and the Global Environmental Council. They moved with a reverence Silas had only ever seen in cathedrals. Among them was Dr. Eris Thorne, a man whose silver hair and deep-set eyes suggested a lifetime of searching for exactly what Silas had found. He approached the trench, stopping at the edge of the vibrant green vines that still held Marcus's abandoned vehicles in a firm, leafy grip. Thorne didn't look at the trapped SUVs. He looked at the pearl-like walls of the vault, his breath catching in a ragged hitch. He looked at Silas and then at Clara, who sat on a nearby stone, peeling an apple with a pocket knife as if the world hadn't just tilted on its axis. "Is it true?" Thorne asked, his voice a mere whisper that carried through the energized air. "The Ethelgard Protocol? Elias Vance's final build?" "It's true," Silas said, stepping forward. He held the leather-bound ledger against his chest. "But it isn't a project anymore. It's an awakening." The journey began shortly after. The ridge had become too small to contain the truth, and the world was demanding an accounting. Silas was summoned to the capital, not as a defendant, but as the primary witness to a history that had been buried for 50 years. He packed only the essentials: the ledger, his grandfather's worn leather apron, and a single vial of the gold-flecked prime strain. As he prepared to leave, he walked to his truck. He found his tablet sitting on the dashboard. It was functional again, but the blueprints for the gated community were gone. In their place was a scrolling list of the other pulse points across the globe: Siberia, the Amazon, the Australian outback, all of them showing a green, active status. The world was breathing again, and he was the one holding the map. Clara stood by the ancient oak as he loaded his gear. "You're leaving the mountains, Silas," she said, her voice warm. "But don't think you're leaving the build. You are the build now. Everywhere you go, you carry the foundation." "I'll be back, Clara," Silas promised. "This ridge is the anchor. I just have to go make sure they don't try to build a fence around the sun." The drive down the mountain was a surreal passage through a changing landscape. As he descended into the valley, he saw people standing on the sides of the road, their faces turned toward the ridge. They had seen the light. They had felt the shift in the air. The local news stations were already broadcasting footage of the Green Pulse, and the internet was a riot of theories and hope. Silas drove past the corporate headquarters of his firm, seeing the frantic activity through the glass walls. They were probably already drafting lawsuits, trying to claim the land, trying to figure out how to monetize the miracle. He kept driving. He didn't belong to them anymore. He traveled east, through the rolling hills and toward the centers of power. Everywhere he stopped, the atmosphere was the same. The seeds his grandfather had planted weren't just in the vaults. They were in the collective memory of the people. In small diners and gas stations, he heard the older generation talking about the old guard, about the scientists and architects who had vanished in the 70s. They remembered the stories. They remembered the promise that someday the earth would fight back. Silas listened, his heart full, realizing that his grandfather hadn't just built a hut. He had built a narrative of resilience. As he reached the outskirts of the capital, the escort arrived, a phalanx of official vehicles, but this time they bore the seals of the International Court and the Department of Global Restoration. The transition from a rural builder to a global guardian was happening in real time. He looked at the marble monuments of the city, structures built to last for centuries, yet he knew they were fragile compared to the organic, self-healing architecture of Project Ethelgard. He felt a profound sense of irony. He had spent his life trying to get into these rooms, to be recognized by these institutions. Now he was coming to them with a power that made their institutions look like sandcastles. The validation was beginning. He could see the headlines on the digital billboards as he moved through the streets. The Vance legacy unveiled, the architect of the future, the end of the gray age. But Silas didn't feel like a celebrity. He felt like a student who had finally understood the lesson. He thought of the rusted hut, the way he had laughed at it, the way he had called it scrap metal. He thought of the beauty of the rust and the precision of the seams. He realized that the journey wasn't about public recognition or institutional honor. It was about the global declassification of hope. He arrived at the grand doors of the National Institute, the ledger tucked firmly under his arm. A crowd of journalists and scientists waited, a sea of cameras and expectant faces. Silas paused at the top of the marble stairs, looking out over the city. He felt the weight of the gold vial in his pocket. He was no longer the arrogant skeptic. He was the humbled guardian. And as he prepared to step inside and change the official record of the world forever, he whispered a single word to the wind, a message to the grandfather who had seen it all coming. Approved! Silas stepped through the towering bronze doors of the National Institute, and the sound of the city vanished, replaced by the hushed, reverent echo of a cathedral dedicated to human knowledge. He felt the weight of the leather ledger against his ribs, a physical anchor in a world that suddenly felt too large and too bright. He walked down the center aisle of the Great Hall, his muddy work boots a stark, defiant contrast to the polished marble floors. Ahead of him sat a long table of dignitaries, scientists, and world leaders, their faces a mixture of skepticism, awe, and a desperate, hungry hope. They had seen the satellite feeds, they had felt the atmospheric shift, but they needed the man who held the key to tell them it was real. He reached the podium and didn't look at the teleprompter or the prepared notes the Institute's assistants had tried to give him. He looked at the crowd, seeing the same hunger for progress that had once driven his own arrogance. But today, he wasn't there to sell them a lifestyle or a gated community. He was there to return an inheritance. Silas reached into the worn leather apron he still wore over his suit, his grandfather's apron, and pulled out the gold-flecked vial. He set it on the marble surface, and the overhead lights caught the swirling liquid, casting dancing amber reflections across the faces of the front row. For 50 years, Silas began, his voice steady and resonant, carrying to the back of the hall without the need for amplification, we have been taught that building means conquering. We were told that to create something new, we had to destroy what was old. We looked at the mountains as obstacles, the forests as timber, and the earth as a platform for our vanity. I was one of those builders. I stood on a ridge and laughed at a rusted hut because I didn't have the eyes to see the masterpiece beneath the oxidation. He opened the ledger, the vellum pages whispering in the silence. My grandfather, Elias Vance, and the ghost builders didn't build a vault to hide from the world. They built a bridge to a future we weren't ready for. They saw the decay coming, and they decided that the most important thing a human could build wasn't a skyscraper or a fortress. It was a sanctuary for the very breath of life. This ledger contains the coordinates for hundreds of vaults, just like the one on the ridge. It contains the frequency of the restoration. As Silas spoke, the massive digital screens behind him flickered to life, displaying the live data streaming from the ridge. The world watched as the green pulse moved across the map, a wave of revitalized soil and purified water spreading from the hidden pulse points. The institutional validation was immediate. One by one, the world's leading biologists and physicists stood, their hands trembling as they viewed the specifications of the Ethelgard protocol. It was a technology that defied their understanding of scarcity, a system that turned the kinetic energy of conflict into the organic energy of growth. The hearing lasted for 6 hours, but Silas didn't feel the fatigue. He felt a profound sense of closure, as if the jagged pieces of his own identity were finally sliding into place. The legacy of the Vance name was no longer a secret buried in a dusty apron. It was the cornerstone of a global turning point. By the time he walked out of the institute, the sunset was painting the capital in hues of violet and gold, and the people in the streets weren't just looking at their phones. They were looking at the trees in the parks, noticing the vibrancy of the leaves as if seeing them for the first time. The return to the ridge was different. Silas didn't drive his expensive truck this time. He took the winding trails on foot, walking the path his grandfather had walked 50 years ago. When he reached the summit, the crystalline vault was glowing with a soft, steady pulse, a heartbeat that matched the mountain. Clara was there, sitting by a small campfire near the ancient oak. The tactical teams were gone. Marcus's empire had been dismantled by a dozen international lawsuits, and the luxury mansions below were being reclaimed by the very vines Silas had called into existence. He sat down beside Clara, the silence between them comfortable and deep. "The world is going to be different now," Silas said, watching the stars begin to emerge over the valley. "They're calling it the Age of the Architect. They want me to lead the restoration of the northern vaults." Clara smiled, the firelight dancing in her eyes. "And will you?" Silas looked at the hut, the beautiful, shimmering structure that had once been his greatest joke. "I'll lead them," he replied. "But I'm not going to build them houses. I'm going to show them how to grow homes. I'm going to show them that the strongest things in this world are often the ones that look the most broken." He reached out and touched the soil, feeling the warmth of the mountain beneath his palm. The journey from the arrogant builder to the humbled guardian was complete. He had realized that the most important build of his life wouldn't be measured in square footage or market value. It would be measured in the silence of the forest, the clarity of the water, and the knowledge that he had finally found his foundation. The rusted hut was gone, replaced by a lighthouse of hope. The builder who had once laughed was now the man who listened, and as the mountain breathed its ancient, revitalized breath, Silas Vance finally closed his eyes and felt at home. Thank you for following the story of the Vance legacy and the secret of the rusted hut. If this journey from arrogance to honor moved you, or if you believe that some things are worth protecting at any cost, please share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories about the hidden truths that shape our world, because sometimes the build that shocks you is the one you were born to complete. From all of us here, thank you for watching, and remember, the most beautiful things in this world are often hidden right in front of us, waiting for the right person to see them. The morning sun beat down on the red clay of the Appalachian Ridge, catching the polished chrome of Ethan's pristine white truck. He stood there with a set of digital blueprints tucked under one arm and a sharp smirk playing on his lips as he looked at the structure blocking his progress. It was a hut, if you could even call it that. It was a jagged collection of corrugated metal plates, bleeding deep orange rust into the tall grass, leaning so heavily to the west it looked like a tired dog ready to lie down and die. Ethan laughed, the sound sharp and dismissive in the quiet mountain air. He saw a nuisance. He saw a pile of scrap metal that a local yard wouldn't even bother to haul away for free. To his modern eyes, it was an eyesore standing in the path of a multi-million-dollar luxury resort. But as the laughter died in his throat, a shadow lengthened across the metal. An elderly woman stood by the corner of the structure, her hand resting on a rusted seam as if she were touching the skin of a beloved, living creature. She didn't look angry. She looked pitying. "You're laughing at the rust, young man," she said, her voice like the dry, rhythmic rustling of autumn leaves. "But the build will shock you, because while you're looking at what the world threw away, you're actually standing on the only thing left that's going to save it." Ethan didn't know it yet, but the most expensive secrets are often hidden under a layer of orange dust. Before the sun set on that ridge, he would realize that the junk he wanted to bulldoze was the only thing holding the world together. From which city in the world are you watching this video today? Drop your location in the comments below. If you want stories about the forgotten legacies that built our nation, hit subscribe. You won't want to miss what happens when Ethan finally steps inside.